Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
I've called this one Intentions, Viewing the Constitution Through the Founder's Eyes. And I'm going to start with a quote from a gentleman who used to be in the Virginia Assembly, who's on YouTube, Nick Freitas. He says, if we don't know why we have these documents, all they are is calligraphy on parchment. Our rights come from God. Government has a limited role in our lives. We have a personal responsibility to ensure that remains so, and to outsource that responsibility is to lose. And really, to outsource that responsibility to politicians? My grandmother had the most wonderful saying that is applicable in so many times. And what she would say was, looking down at you when you'd done something dumb, "What are you, stupid?" With a good whack upside the head with that little flick of the wrist that really transfers the wisdom into your brain. So to outsource that responsibility to politicians, what are you, stupid? True. So in order to fulfill our duty and take on our responsibility, we need to know what it is. The week we spend here at Camp Constitution is a drop in a bucket. There's another 51 weeks in the year, and in those weeks, you are on your own to try to figure this out. Right? And there'll be times when you take out the Constitution to look something up and you read something and you're looking at it going, okay, what does that mean? And you have a couple of choices there. You can go to YouTube. Camp Constitution has over a decade's worth of line-by-line, step-in-step instruction from fabulous instructors on exactly what each of those lines mean. But there's another quote from somewhere that says, if I tell you, you will not know. You will merely have been told. Better to learn to figure it out for yourself. Last year we talked about the tools you need to analyze the Constitution, but this year I'm going to look at the outlook, the mindset that you need to put on that will clear up confusion, misapprehension, and the, what does this mean? Questions that arise when you look at the Constitution. The founder's outlook. You know, if you want to understand why somebody has said what they've said, why they've done what they've done, you need to know what their outlook is. Right? The facts and the circumstances that surrounded the creation of the Constitution, the world they live in, determined how they framed the Constitution and everything that they wrote. Every single word in the entire document, the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution, were written with specific reasons for everything, including the word choices and the tense choices. Everything was in there for a reason. If we know the lens that they used to look at it, it's going to help us understand the structure, the choices they made, the intentions they had, the meaning they were imbuing into their document, and the dangers in the future that they were able to see. And on Wednesday, we'll talk about some of the dangers they were not able to see and the repercussions of those. So to ourselves, that was them, and our posterity, that's us. There are all kinds of posterity, though. There's religious, cultural, educational, legal, historical, and the posterity of societal entanglements. Right? For the religious posterity, they had the biblical basis of governing. Everything that Pastor Whitney said an hour ago comes into play here. The biblical basis of our government, for the Lord is our judge. The Lord is our lawgiver. The Lord is our king. He will save us. No man, no bunch of elected politicians or unelected bureaucrats. The Lord will save us. Now, he acts through people, but it isn't the people who save, it is the Lord's. But then we have to add in, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. So there is a godly, proper governing authority put in place with structures that are subject to God's authority. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. So God institutes the authority of good government, but when there are dictates of an evil government, we are instead to obey God rather than that government. You need to know how to discern what the proper authority of government is and what it is not, and what is good and what is evil, or else you make the wrong choices. So this new nation, the Constitution was written in 1787. It was 12 years after Lexington and Concord, 11 years after the Declaration of Independence. The new nation, very young at that time, was to continue as a Christian nation. Various sects and denominations were going to be given equal access to political power, to wealth, to voting privileges, to property ownerships, and much more. The non-Christian population of the United States back in 1787, not counting the Indian tribes, was about 1% at best. Most of the states back in 1787 had an established denomination as the official religion in that state. And in 1787, there was no indication that that was ever going to change. If you were in Massachusetts, you were a Congregationalist. If you were in Rhode Island, you were Catholic, etc. The states, lots of them were established. The whole purpose of their existence was to create a place for free worship in a specific religious faith tradition, and in a little bit we'll look at the why of some of that. And separation of church and state, which is not in the Constitution. It was in a private letter from Jefferson to a Baptist congregation in Connecticut. Separation of church and state means that the state can't interfere with Christian worship, and it cannot prohibit Christian sects from practicing their faith. It was freedom of religion, not a freedom from religion. What they were trying to prevent was, what they really wanted was no Mexican standoff. Again, from history that we'll see. So the original settlers, Massachusetts and Vermont and New Hampshire, were Congregational, which was an outgrowth of the Puritans. Rhode Island was founded and established as a Catholic refuge from persecution of Catholics in Massachusetts. Maryland was founded as a Catholic state. Later it was changed to officially an Anglican state. Pennsylvania didn't have a specific religion, but it required you to be a Christian to be a citizen. New York was Anglican. It allowed Christians to be citizens, but it did impose some restrictions on Catholics. Connecticut was Congregational, and New Jersey, now they were very avant-garde. They even welcomed strange and weird Christian fringe groups like Presbyterians and Dutch Reformed, right? They were really forward-thinking. An established denomination back in 1787 doesn't mean anything about putting a nativity scene in front of town hall, or a Christmas tree on the town common, or singing hymns in a hymn sing, again, on town property at Christmas time. Established denomination means that they were supported by public funds, tax money. That there might or might not be restrictions on the practices of other traditions. So if you were in a congregational state, you might not be able to practice Roman Catholicism openly. You might have to have a small house church, but you couldn't have a church building. You might not be able to vote if you were Catholic in a congregational state. You might not be able to be a full citizen. You might not be able to own property. There were all kinds of restrictions in the states based on their official faith. So an established religion is supported by public funds with membership required for voting or for holding state office, and sometimes with restrictions for non-members. They could have required attendance at the established religion services on a specific schedule. All kinds of things that go into established religion. But the continuing leadership in the states being Christian was assumed. It was one of those presuppositions like Pastor Whitney was talking about earlier, but this one was not a God-given right type presupposition, and it was not codified anywhere. And if you were a Catholic in Massachusetts and you did not have the full rights of citizenship and you wanted those, you could move to Rhode Island. Some of the states were founded on that type of movement. Pastor Jonas Clark, who was a Minuteman on the Lexington Green on April 1775, stated, "We recognize no sovereign but God and no king but Jesus." That would probably get you lynched if you said it in Lexington Common today. But our strengths and our odd little weaknesses all trace to this belief. So culturally, every one of the colonies was Christian. Later, every one of the states was Christian. Education was Christian. Community life was centered on the church and church connections because they were just, towns grew up around a church. It wasn't that towns were founded and then churches came in. You had a little settlement, you built a church, a town grew around it. Non-Christians were an extremely tiny minority, often transient, not even permanent. And the entire purpose for founding many of the colonies was for the glory of God and the dissemination of the Christian faith to the world. And that wording is taken just about verbatim from the Mayflower Compact. Church attendance, some people will say, well, back in 1787, church attendance wasn't that high on a weekly basis. Well, church attendance is not the same thing as your depth of faith. And if you are 5 miles from the church out on a farm and you're walking, that's an hour and a half walk each way with a 2 or 3 hour service in the middle. It's the entire day. So a lot of people did not go to church on a regular basis, but they still had devotionals in their home. Church attendance is not a metric of the depth of your faith. And the other way goes too. You can go to church every week and think you're a Christian and not be one because you're just there to warm the seat. The population was largely rural and very small. Towns were tiny, cities were small. There were tons and tons of resources. There was timber, there was fish, there was the various produce of the farms. There wasn't much money. And those had real repercussions in the society at the time. And in terms of political power, we were kind of forgettable, ignorable. The only draw here was the natural resources. We were out in the middle of nowhere, a month's ocean voyage from any center of political power or interest. And this was the truth until about World War I. Although, crossing the ocean got a little faster, went down from a month to a week. Right? And any concept back in 1787 that the US would be a world power, a major player on the world stage, would have gotten you laughed out of town. We just weren't important. Education, again, as Pastor Whitney pointed out. Education is, and was seen then, as the duty of parents. Now most parents think it's the duty of the state, because they have outsourced their duty to politicians. What are you, stupid? Schools were local. They were locally controlled. Many of them only held classes in the winter when the farm duties were lighter, which is why we have summers off to this day. It's when the kids were needed on the farm. There were tiny little like neighborhood schools, sometimes called dame schools or petty schools, that just taught reading and writing to little boys and little girls, and they were run mainly by moms. There were more formal schools, but those were for older boys. There were what they called the Latin schools that prepared boys for admission to universities because they needed Latin. Then there were the English schools, which taught everything in English, and they ignored Latin. Those had academics, but were for a more practical outlook. There were private tutors, and there were boarding schools in England. One of George Washington's great regrets in life was that he was not able to go away to boarding school in England like his older brother went. And he always felt that he needed to catch up to his brother's level of education, so he educated himself. So everything was run and monitored and paid for directly by the parents. It was religious, and it was practical. There was no separation of God and academics. There was a book called the New England Primer that was widely used. It was really basic, lots of rhymes, lots of learning by rote. As soon as you had anything approaching the basic ability to read, you were started in on the Bible. And the main purpose of reading was to allow children to read and understand the Bible so that they could grow to be moral and godly adults. That was really seen as the purpose of education, the main purpose. After that, there were the practical schools for living, like writing, penmanship. There's no typing your letters, right? Everything was handwritten, which meant that the recipient had to be able to read them. Yes, sir?
What does learning by rote mean?
Memorization. Way back in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, that sort of thing. Okay? So writing, arithmetic, and history. Beyond practical skills, it was what you needed for your apprenticeships. Wealthier boys who would study Latin, they would need that if they were going into law or into medicine, into ministerial or pastoral training, or any field requiring more than the basics. But again, the underlying purpose was to develop godly, moral, and productive citizens and future parents to the next generation. What learning looked like was you learned at home with parents or in the local dame or petty school. Schooling was limited in time, scheduled around farm, household, and seasonal chores. There was no distinction between religious learning and secular learning. And after you had the basics, it was heavily geared towards what you were going to do with the rest of your life. Legal posterity. Basis was the English common law. The common law of England goes back to the Saxon tribes with some influences from the Roman invasion of England back almost 2,000 years ago. This was largely unwritten. There were sections of it that were written, but a lot of it wasn't until William Blackstone completed his commentaries on the laws of England. It was a huge work, many volumes. It was largely completed at the time of our founding, but not quite. I think it was the early 1800s when the final volume was published. But it's got a vast body of delineations of duties and privileges for the rulers as well as for the citizenry. And the Law of Nations, Aimé de Vattel, is a thorough treatise and discourse on international law, national sovereignty, and the duties of the rulers and the ruled. Both of these are available in the online Library of Liberty. It's like oll.liberty.org or something like that. Google it. Men and governments are subject to God's natural law, was his premise, and that traces all the way back to Cicero. And using that as his premise, he examined all aspects of international law, with the repercussions of those laws being explained. Now, this was published in French in 1758, and believe it or not, modern scholars claimed that they could not have used this as a reference in writing the Constitution because there was no English translation published until like the 1800s. Let's just ignore the fact that every educated man, university-educated man in those days, of which the founders were all, could read, write, and speak Latin. They could read and write ancient Greek. They could read, write, and speak French and English, at least. Many of them also spoke other languages like German or Italian, Spanish. So the fact that the Law of Nations was available in French does not disqualify it as a resource. It's available in English today. Sometime go read the differences between citizens, residents, inhabitants, vagrants, transients. It's chapter 19, sections 212 and forward. In history, the founders all knew this, and this was, again, in their minds. The history of the Greek city-states with the dangers of unfettered democracy. The history of the Roman Republic that then became too bold in its self-defense by becoming functionally belligerent itself. So they overexpanded. They subjected the countries they conquered to brutal harshness. Then they started importing immigrants to be their mercenaries, and then they deteriorated and fell, and Europe balkanized after that and split into dozens of little countries again. After the fall of the Rome, they came the Dark Ages. There were alliances among the little countries. There were wars among the little countries, and then there were more alliances, and then there were more wars, and then there was corruption in the Catholic Church, and then there was corruption in the monarchies, and then there was the Protestant Reformation. The invention of the printing press and the availability of the Bible were huge. The translation of the Bible into vernacular languages was met by vicious opposition to the church because they were losing their monopoly power. And I would point out that the monasteries, after the printing press, lost their position as the repository of knowledge. And think about the emergence now of AI and what that is going to do to the university system. Just think about it. Look for the parallels. All right, the historical baggage. Wars between the Protestants and the Catholics. After Henry VIII broke with Rome and he passed on, his two daughters, Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth, were both contending for the throne. They both took the throne at various times. Depending on who was in power, they executed members of the other faith. They burned them at the stake as heretics. There were also fines and imprisonments as common but lesser level punishments because the religious stuff had gotten completely intertwined with the political power. And there were repeated attempts by France and Spain to infiltrate and overturn Protestant rule in England so that they could put a Catholic leader back on the throne. So was it political warring? Was it religious warring? You couldn't even tell the difference. And similar problems were all throughout Europe. You know, there were Lutheran countries, and there were Calvinist countries, and there were this countries and that countries, and they all wanted to take over their neighbors. So after the Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth came out ahead in the end and imposed Anglicanism over the entirety of England. They remained extremely suspicious of power struggles amongst Christian sects, especially what they called the Catholic problem, which lingered centuries after Elizabeth I. There was huge talk, I think in the 1800s, about whether or not Catholic English subjects should be allowed to own land or vote. They were seen as potential traitors because that was what history had told them. You let Catholics into power and they're going to make alliances with France, and then you've got a French contender for the throne and you've got a war. Okay, no Catholics. Because that was the history. They were barred from some professions for the same reason. You could get wealth and power and then become a danger to the crown. They weren't allowed to vote. They weren't allowed to hold public offices. In some of the shires, they weren't allowed to own property. When the Puritan type groups arose, they got hit with the same suspicions. They were trying to be pure Christians and take out some of the Anglican fancy observances, some of the liturgical stuff that was carried over from Catholicism. They wanted to make it more simple, but they were then seen as another set of potential traitors. And they didn't help their own cause when they participated in the English Civil War on the side against the English monarchs. The New World, meaning North America, gave them a chance to start over. Then there was the Enlightenment philosophy that emphasized reason and individualism. It promoted liberty, it limited government, intellectual analysis of all problems. And originally, Ben Franklin was a very strong proponent of this philosophy in the United States. And we'll cover next session that there are underlying issues that affect us to this day because, again, a subversive philosophy doesn't get a lot of traction calling itself subversive from the start. You candy coat the poison. Then we faced increasing tyranny. Stamp Act, Boston Massacre, the Currency Act, the Quartering Act, Townshend Act, the Sugar Act, blockade of Boston Harbor. Then finally, the attempt to disarm the colonists in Lexington and Concord that they still have parades about without understanding what was going on. And bills of attainder, which is the Parliament or the Crown simply saying, you're guilty, we're taking all your stuff. That's it. You're guilty, we're taking all your stuff. All your money, all your property, get out of Dodge. All of these were major intrusions of government power, centralized government power, on individual lives and individual livelihoods. Keep that in mind when you read the Constitution. What were they trying to prevent? All of this stuff. So the War for Independence, King and Parliament were not following the common law protections for British subjects. They spent 30 years just saying, will you please treat us like other British subjects? And they were told, no. They had no representation. There were the intrusive policies. In short, tyranny under a central government that had way more power than anything authorized by God. I covered a lot of this in prior years. You can go look those up. You can make up your own list of things to investigate. But everything that the colonists chafed under, everything that they hated, every overreach of the Crown and British rule in general was addressed in the Constitution. And it might be that some of the problems we have today is that they spent a little bit too much time looking back and not quite enough time looking forward. But we'll talk about that later. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was a failure. They overreacted to the tyranny of the government under George III. And when they created a weak central government on purpose, they went too far. Pendulum swung too far. They created a structure that was too weak to function. And they really did need something that worked. The central structure was falling apart, and they needed drastic steps for the nation to survive. And why did they want the nation to survive? Well, England wanted us back. France and Spain wanted the money that they had loaned us, plus they wanted the resources. There were a lot of reasons why failure was not an option. It was an existential concern. If we do not act, we will cease to exist. So the Constitutional Convention of 1787 was called for the sole and exclusive purpose to propose amendments to the Articles of Confederation. But they ended up having to chuck the whole thing and write a new constitution with completely different rules for ratification. Although a whole bunch of the sections in the new Constitution were taken from the Articles of Confederation, and it can be interesting to go and do a compare and contrast between those two. Now, as for foreign entanglements, George Washington warned against entangling alliances with other nations. He wanted us to focus on being neutral, being friendly with everybody, and concentrate on internal domestic issues, because that's plenty for a small government to concern itself with. That any alliances should be rare and should be temporary. And if you want to know why he promoted that so hard, go look at the history of Europe. Long-term alliances caused so many problems to so many countries, and we should have listened. We really should have listened. Once you get foreign alliances as a regular and more permanent thing in your government, you then become required to add to the defense of your nation, because the enemy of your friend has now become your enemy. And then you get into the same path that the Roman Republic took, where the idea of self-defense morphs into, let's get them before they get us. So we'll go get them, and then now we're in charge of them. Go look up why we were in the Philippines in the 1800s. Why we were in a lot of places. Get them before they get us. The Roman Republic took that path and became the empire. The way to avoid the enticement is not to take the first steps. The first steps always look completely reasonable unless you're analyzing it with history in the forefront of your mind and not just reacting viscerally. So we should have listened to Rome's history too. Mutual defense pacts with other nations don't stay defensive only. Little nations become belligerent because they know if we provoke somebody to attack us, we can call on the mutual defense rules and our big brother will come beat them up for us. You want proof? Look at the history of Europe from the fall of Rome all the way through 2 world wars. And in fact, you can look at what's going on in Europe right now. Ever sat in the back seat with your little brother who keeps coming this close to poking at you until you finally swat him? Mom, he hit me. That's what nations do. They never outgrew it. That's what I've got for you today, unless you've got questions. But again, it's the outlook. Where were their minds? What was going on around them? What was history teaching them? What were they defending themselves against? What were they trying to prevent coming into them? Yeah. The encroachment of more tyranny. But put on that mindset and apply it to the piece of the Constitution that currently has you confused. And chances are very strong that you'll go, aha, I got it. That's what they were doing. Questions?